I want to talk this morning about the issue of gender. The children here, you're happy with that, that's fine. I think that it's suitable, but you might want to. It's your choice as parents to know whether you want your child to stay. The first question you might ask is why? Talking about this issue of gender, which is a good question. Why don't I ask myself a few times this week? Look, this is a highly topical issue. It's on the news a lot, it's being talked about. It's a hot button topic for our young people in particular. It's dominated, the last year, it's dominated Scottish politics. It nearly brought down the government over there. The issue around choosing one's gender is being promoted in schools. Public places are being questioned around their policies, around toilets and changing rooms. Makes the headlines when people like Posse Parker, who's a radical feminist, comes and wants to speak on the issue. J.K. Rowling has been vilified and cancelled for her stance on this issue. There are a massive rise in the number of children who are confused around their gender. We're being taught to use different pronouns for different people. New Zealand last year changed the law so that for $55 you can change your birth certificate that declares your gender. We're now being told there are multiple genders we can choose from. It's also a confusing array of terms to get your head around: cisgender, non-binary, etc. Now, this might seem an abstract issue to you until your child comes home from school and says that they don't want to be a girl anymore. It might seem an abstract issue until someone who identifies as trans is in your workplace and wants you to use different pronouns. It might seem abstract until someone you do not even realise was trans suddenly tries to commit suicide. It might seem an abstract issue until someone in your home group or your family confesses that they've never felt comfortable in their biological body. At that point, it doesn't become abstract, but it becomes very real and very confusing. Now, I realise for many of us, you might shake your head and say, man, a man, woman, a woman, what is the issue here? You might even ridicule the debate. Why are we even talking about this? 2020, 0.8% of adults in New Zealand identified as transgender. That's around 32,000. Or other figures have it closer to 20,000, so a bit of a range there. 2012 survey, New Zealand survey again, suggested around 4% of our young people are confused or unsure of their gender or identified as trans. So if you put that in the context of Hargest, that's 64 young people. So even if you're not grappling with this issue, your kids are, or your grandchildren are confronting this issue. Now, I enter this space with some trepidation. This is a hot button issue. I've never spoken about it before. My learnings on this are new. I've spent considerable time over both last year and this year reading both sides of the debate. I have a sermon summary. I've run off some extra copies there. It is word for word, so I'm not misquoted. So what's here is exactly the same as what's out there. It also includes at the bottom some references, including references that take a different viewpoint. So it's really important that we understand that churches and Christians have different views on the subject. There's not a uniform response. And look, while I've read stories of people who identify as trans, I've not spent time personally with anyone. I've not walked the journey with a parent who is grappling with this issue. Also can't cover all the issues in 20 minutes. This is a complex space and I can't cover everything. So I've given some resources, not by no means all the resources, but I've given some resources in the summary. I'm stealing my sermon outline, I'm stealing from a web article by Preston Sprinkle, I think, hasn't got an L, Sprink, who's also written one of the books that I recommend on this subject. I want to make a number of different points. The first we need to just, which might seem obvious, but actually is really, really important to understand that trans people are people and not issues. The thing about the discussion around the transgender issue, sometimes it can focus on bathrooms and policies and ideologies. And the language often that's used is one of anger and outrage. And in the midst of all this, we forget that trans people are people and not issues. They're made in the image of God. They're good people, they're beautiful people, they're worthy of dignity and respect. We need to learn from them and listen to them. They are not issues to be solved. Our reputation often as Christians is one of being judgmental and angry. We're seen as anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-lots of things. Jesus somehow had a reputation for being for people. So to illustrate this book, I want to tell you some stories that are from this book that I recommended called Embodied. Alan grew up as a pastor's kid. Ever since he could remember, he had his desire to dress and act like a woman. But he saw how his church had reacted to the LGBTQI community, and so he told no one of this. He left school, he left church because he was tired of the hypocrisy that he saw. One day, though, a Christian friend asked to hear Alan's story, and so he told him, including why he'd left church, and he also told him of his desire to be a woman. To his utter surprise, his friend loved him and told him that God loved him, despite his desires. And because of the reaction of this friend, he gave his life to the Lord. He says that without this grace, he would have transitioned to be a woman and walked away from God. Stephanie grew up in these are true stories. Stephanie grew up as a typical girl, though she was on the spectrum for autism. When she was 13, she told her mother out of the blue that she was transgender. Her mum found this was after a talk that she'd heard at school. She went to a medical clinic about it and was told she had to refer to her daughter with masculine pronouns and a masculine name. She was also directed to put her on puberty-blocking drugs. Her mum feared that if she pushed back on this, she might be reported to the education department, as was the policy where she lived in one of the states in America. Benjamin is a pastor, but for his whole life, he has struggled with gender dysphoria. Hannah is a lovely, friendly Christian who transitioned from a female to a male a few years ago. Kyla transitioned to a male 8 years ago, but then encountered Jesus and transitioned back to be a female. These are real people who are grappling with deep and real and personal issues, and they are precious and they are loved by God. Trans people are people and not issues. The second thing, which you picked up from those stories, is that trans people, this is incredibly diverse. There's a scholar in this field who makes the statement, if you've met one trans person, you have met one trans person. I.e., people's experiences are incredibly diverse and we can't lump people together. Some people experience gender dysphoria. That's where they feel they're in the wrong body from a young age. Some people don't experience it at all until after adolescence. Some experience it their whole lives. For others, it goes away. In fact, 61 to 88% of children who experience gender dysphoria grow out of it. Some people who identify as trans never experience dysphoria at all. Some people identify as trans and believe they're born into the wrong body. Some want to transition. Some transition socially, i.e. they present as the opposite sex. Some both transition socially and also physically through surgery. So if someone identifies to you that they're trans, you really know nothing more about the person except that they identify as trans. This is an umbrella identity. Thirdly, and this is the bit where life gets confusing and you've got to get your head around this. Sex is different from gender. Now, as I say, the conversation gets messy at this point. Prior to 1970, the words gender and sex were used interchangeably. But now they're used to mean different things. So sex refers to your biological sex, i.e. whether you're born male or female. Gender is more complicated. Gender is described as the physiological, social and cultural aspects of being male or female. And it can be broken down into three sections. There's gender identity. That's the internal sense of self that you have as a male or female, or both or neither. Gender expression is how the person expresses themselves through their clothing or their hairstyle or whatever, how they present, how they express their gender. Gender role is the cultural expectation of how males and females should act. So you've got, within this word gender, you've got these three sort of categories. In the discussion around trans, the primary area of focus and debate is the idea of gender identity. All right, that the first one, gender identity. What is it? Is it subjective? Is it objective? And the key question is, if someone experiences tension between their biological sex and their gender identity, which one determines who they are and why? All right, if someone experiences tension between their biological sex and their gender identity, which one determines who they are and why? Now, for most of us, we've never experienced that at all. We've never experienced such a tension, and so this seems like a weird idea. But what we have to know is that for many who are trans, this is a deep struggle, a deep challenge for them. It's a real and lived experience, this tension between the two. Fourth point I want to make is that most gender stereotypes come from culture and not the Bible. Both the Bible and science recognise there are two categories of biological sex, male and female. It's a small number who might be intersex or both. Now, the Bible doesn't give us, within male and female, gives very few markers of how we should act. There's virtually no prescriptions in the Bible to determine how men and women should act. A few years ago, I did a men's talk on what it means to be a godly man. And I could not find any things in the Bible that says how a godly man should act that was any different from how a godly woman should act. Just could not find them. I mean, there's stuff about fathers, but not all men are fathers. So that sort of rules that out. Just could not find. They're just not there. Sometimes in our culture, we'd say that men should be tough or the breadwinners, strong, should be leaders in the world and home. That's not in the Bible. Women are, typically nurturing and kind and look after children. Again, that's some cultural assumptions. It's not in the Bible. You read in the Bible of men kissing each other, of men crying, being emotional. You look at the relationship with Jonathan and David, an intense relationship. It talks about men being loving and sensitive and kind and peacemakers and teaching children. Proverbs 31, a description of a godly wife. It's a description that defies stereotypes. I think I did a master's paper on this years ago on this passage because I studied Proverbs. And it just defies. This godly wife is an entrepreneur and a social activist and a breadwinner, as well as a wife and a mother. Jesus defied stereotypes, cultural stereotypes. Sure, he stood up for religious leaders. He overturned the tables in the temple. Maybe that's more sort of masculine, more aggressive, but then he wept over Jerusalem. He let others hit him. He loved those who opposed him. He hung out with outcasts and women. That was not what a Jewish man was meant to do. So the Bible has very few prescriptions around how we should act within our gender. And how gender is expressed is incredibly cultural. Just a very simple example. Men dress in Scotland with kilts. Samoan men wear, wrap-around sort of skirt dresses. So how gender is expressed is culturally gender is expressed is very culturally driven. What we are called to do is to act more like Jesus, not act more like a man or a woman. Fifth point I want to make is that our bodies are good. Fundamental truth and human identity is found in Genesis 1:27. God created humankind as an image of God. He created them male and female. He created them. What does it mean to bear the image of God? It's a profound question. It's interesting, the word image that's used, made in the image of, is the same word that's used to describe an idol. So you make this wooden idol, and you say that idol expresses the image of a spiritual deity. We are the physical representation of a non-physical being that is God. Now, obviously, we're more than just physical beings, that our physical being is a key part of what it means to be made in the image of God. And this physical being is made in either male or female. It's a scientific reality. We're either one gender or the other. And nothing can change that. No matter how we might express, whatever gender we might express, whatever surgery we might have, does not change that. Our sexual being is integral to who we are in the image of God. And our bodies are described as good, as sacred. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, says Paul. We're not actually our true selves without our bodies. That's why when Christ returns, we are going to be given a new physical body. We cannot be defined apart from our embodied sex. So I said, though, that there is division around within Christian circles on this matter. So there are a number of arguments used by some people that says that using the Bible to justify that gender should win out over physical sex. I.e., if we have this tension inside of us, then the internal sense should win over the biological. Now, I don't agree with these arguments, but I think you need to be aware these arguments are here. And there are four basic arguments. There's not actually hundreds. There are four basic arguments that are used. The first is that Genesis 1 assumes a non-binary aspect to creation. That is, God creates day and night. We understand that, but in between day and night, we have other things. So these descriptions are like the outer limits. So, but in between day and night is, say, dusk. God created animals, creatures for the land and the sea, but some animals fall between the two, like a frog. So when God says He created male and female, the argument will go that doesn't exclude anything in between. However, the Bible only ever gives two categories of humans, male and female. Humans differ in how they express that male and femaleness, but it doesn't mean that sex categories exist in addition to male and female. By saying that male and female is simply referring to their biological sex, not what we have labelled as gender. Second argument which is used, which is quite a common argument, is that Jesus was affirmative of eunuchs. Eunuchs, Jesus talks about the fact that at the end of a passage in Matthew 19 on marriage and divorce, he says, there are eunuchs who are born that way, others have been made eunuchs, and some choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Those who accept this should accept it. Now, Jesus was using eunuchs to illustrate his point about not marrying. In the ancient world, eunuchs were always male. Some were born either with issues of intersex or they were born infertile. Some had been castrated, but they are an illustration of singleness, and Jesus is affirming them. Now, Jesus' affirmation of eunuchs actually contradicted both Old Testament law, where eunuchs were not allowed in the temple, and it certainly contradicted Jewish society's view of masculinity. So we read that wonderful story in Acts of Philip baptizing the eunuch into the early church, accepted into the new community of faith. They would not have been within the temple system. But there's no indication that Jesus' argument around this, or Jesus using eunuchs as an example, there's nothing about how a person feels about their biological sex. He's using them as an example to affirm singleness. It's not actually talking about trans as we understand trans today. Third argument that's used is Galatians 3:28. It's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, neither male or female, so you're all one in Christ. Arguments used to say, well, actually, Paul's saying that sex differences no longer matter. It's not actually what Paul is arguing. What he's saying is, he's not arguing that these differences disappear when we become Christian. What he's saying is that the woman who is treated as a second-class citizen is now equal in the kingdom. The slave who was a second-class citizen is now an equal. The Gentile is now an equal. We know these differences of male, female, slave, free, Gentile, Jew, they don't disappear when we become Christians. They're just no longer limiting factors of who we are in the church and the kingdom. And the last argument that's used is there's no marriage in the resurrection. Jesus again is having a debate with the religious leaders about marriage, and he says, well, actually in the world to come, life to come, there's no marriage in heaven. And there's some argued, well, does that mean that our sexual differences disappear? We're sort of androgynous. Jesus never said that. He simply said we wouldn't marry. Jews certainly did not see the angels as sexless. And Jesus, when he was resurrected, clearly was recognized as a man. So that's the counter-arguments around this issue. Why has this issue suddenly sort of hit the headlines? Why? This was a non-issue 20 years ago. When I studied at Bible College, not an issue. Why is this suddenly this massive issue within our society? Well, what's happened is a whole series of ideologies and teachings have come, in a sense, into this issue and are starting to bear fruit, as it were, and that's why we're seeing this massive debate. The first is this idea of relativism. There's no right or wrong. So no one actually has the authority to tell us how to live. Everything is relative, and so you live how you want to live. There's individualism, very strong in our society, where we just focus on ourselves. You're free to be whoever you want to be. The whole sexual revolution said, actually, we separate sex from marriage, and so your body is your own to do what you want with. Gnosticism, which actually is a really ancient idea that came about, was around during Paul's time, says that actually if there's a tension between the body and the inner being, then actually the inner being is more important than the body. Body's sort of neither here nor there, but actually your internal self is your true self. And then there's consumerism. Consumerism says actually you can be whatever you choose to be. We hear this all the time with our kids. You can choose who you want to be. And then there's queer theology, or theory, that seeks to normalize homosexuality and says actually your identity is not fixed. Now, so these are key sort of drivers within our society, and they're all pushing, and they've all sort of accumulated into suddenly this becoming a major issue. So how is we as a church to respond to the growing trans community? I mean, there is a place, we have a place to oppose destructive ideologies in our culture today, especially when we see them having impact on our children. But we need to be really careful how we enter this space, because anger and outrage do not change things. Love, in the end, changes things. We need to be really sure, and the church has done this very, very badly, but we need to ensure we reject gender and cultural stereotypes and don't dress them up in spiritual language. If we actually created a far more biblical view of gender expression, it would actually help trans believers potentially more easily express themselves within their biological sex. But typically we've put a spiritual language around what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, and actually is not biblically justified. We do not have to be bullied into accepting radical teaching of society that rejects God's created order. And there's a very strong bullying sort of culture, cancel culture today. We should actively welcome trans people into the church community and be creating a community where they feel safe. The trans community has terrible, terrible stats in terms of loneliness, in terms of suicide, in terms of exclusion from families. Seems to me that Jesus went out of his way to identify with the marginalized in society and the shamed and the hurting. Actually wanted to be with Jesus. If Jesus were here today, he would have trans friends. Absolutely. We need a posture of humility, recognizing we don't understand, for most of us, another person's journey. And lastly, we need to recognize that every person, all of us, carry a distorted image of who we're meant to be. We're all on a journey to find our true identity in Jesus Christ, and this is a lifetime journey. So we need to be really, really patient with those we journey with who struggle with gender identity. I want to close with a story, and it's an incredibly powerful story. Leslie was born a female, but from the age of 4, felt like a boy. She also, at a very early age, fell in love with Jesus. But as she grew older and into adolescence, she struggled to relate to being a female and became increasingly depressed and suicidal. She eventually got up the courage and went to share with the pastor, and she was told to leave and never come back. So she left the church, and she found love and acceptance in the LGBTQI community. She fell in love with another woman, Sue, and they married. Now, Sue happened to have a condition that caused her hands to shake, and one night Sue went out to light a cigarette. Now, as she was lighting the cigarette, she lit fire to herself. Leslie rushed outside for the screams of her partner and saw her partner aflame. Tragically, Sue died a few days later from her injuries. Sue was obviously traumatised, deeply traumatised by what she'd seen, and grief-stricken having lost her life partner. Now, she had not been at a church for 18 years at this point, but for some reason, she wanted the church to do the funeral, and she called the only church she could think of in her neighbourhood that was a very, very conservative church. And this is what she said: "Hi, my name's Leslie, and my wife just died. We're lesbians, but I want to know if you do my wife's funeral." Now, the pastor didn't say, "Well, I'll have to think about that." We didn't say, "Well, actually, here's what we think about lesbian lifestyles." Now, remember, this is a very conservative church. The first words he said were, "We would be honoured to do that. We would be honoured to do that." He said, "I'm sorry for your loss." This is his quote. "You must be truly grieving right now. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose a loved one. Please, Leslie, let us take care of all the details of the funeral. The cost, the arrangements, whatever you need. Please, Leslie, let us love you through your pain." This very conservative church surrounded Leslie with love, something she had not experienced from Christians before. Remember her previous experience. She had only experienced that kind of love from the LGBTQI community. Her experience of this church brought her back to faith and love for Jesus. She prefers to identify now as non-binary and be addressed by them and they pronouns. She believes in a traditional view of marriage between a man and a woman. She is attracted to the same sex. She has a deep and profound love for God and lives out her faith in many practical ways. I think this is an incredibly powerful story because it shows, A, the real struggle of people. It shows the impact of rejection, how our actions can actually turn people away from Christ. It shows the power of outrageous love. I hugely admire that pastor for having the presence of mind to say those words. It also shows the fact that discipleship is a journey. We might struggle that Leslie sees herself as non-binary or that she's attracted. It doesn't say she's acting out, but she's attracted to the same sex. But she, like all of us, is on a journey. And according to the author, is living out her faith in very powerful ways to others. I'd love that we could be the kind of church that Leslie experienced. Questions? Anyone have any questions? It's not right or wrong questions, it's questions. Sorry, yes?
I have had experience with trans people.
Hang on, I'll get a mic because I get into trouble.
I have had experience of trans people through the jail.
Right.
And I think the government's approach was check the plumbing. And if they're male, they go to a male jail. So we've had a couple through ours. Their interpretation of Genesis 1:27 was God made them male and female. He created them in their image, in his image, and he created them male and female together. Like, for instance, in your body,
Right.
you are created male and female.
Right.
Your male genome is dominant.
Right.
And that's the argument is more of a combination than a middle ground sort of affair. What's your thoughts?
Well, there's two issues. One is biological sex, and the other is gender. So, in terms of gender expression, there is a spectrum. So, obviously, many, how gender is expressed is a spectrum, and so men can have very feminine traits, some females can have very masculine traits. But from a biological sex point of view, there is only, and scientific point of view, there are only two genders. So, yeah. However, many in the trans community would use the argument to say, I've been born into the wrong body. I've got a female brain and a male body. Not sure scientifically that stacks up, but I don't claim to be an expert on that either. But I'm not sure that has a biological basis. Yes?
At the church, who the guy's homosexual, and when he was told. My question is, where's the love? Because the Bible says very clearly, there's no sin bigger or smaller than another one. A sin is a sin, and the measure that you judge with is the measure that we will be judged one day when we stand in front of God. And if we judge them, then we will be judged. I have a granddaughter who's 6 years old who told her dad, and she said to him very clearly, and they've got two daughters, one very feminine, one not so feminine. And she said to her dad, I don't want to be a mum one day. I want to be a dad one day because you've got a nice life.
So I don't think anyone chooses, if you've got gender dysphoria, my understanding is no one chooses that. In fact, many of the trans community would see it as a sort of curse in a sense that, why would I have this struggle? So I don't think many people choose, and so how they act on that is a choice, but people don't choose that internal sort of struggle. So yeah. Yep.
So, Keith, I guess statistically speaking, it's quite possible that there'll be someone sitting here today or someone in our congregation or a number of people in our congregation who are experiencing some of that gender dysphoria. And so I guess, and their struggle would be real, and you talked about the loneliness and the increased suicidal tendency. And so I guess my question is, how should we respond? What should we be doing as a church to ensure that that people experiencing that, who have that experience, experience their love and experience acceptance? So, practically speaking, is there anything you think we should be doing?
I think it's really important the language we use. It's very easy to mock, men are men, get over it or whatever. So the language we use, that we don't, we actually acknowledge that the trans person feels heard and listened to. So their story is their story. So I think it's really important that in terms of the language we use, if we come across with a posture of anger or judgment, then that they or any minority community are very sensitive to that. We'll pick that up. So I think the first is simply to listen, that we listen well to their story. We don't judge. We don't make assumptions. We don't understand. We don't understand or it's highly likely we don't understand. We can't fully understand their journey. So I think that posture of humility, of accepting them as a person first, made in the image of God, is critical. I think we've got to allow, like those examples I gave, there was a spectrum of examples I gave. We've got to allow God and His Spirit to work in a person's life, not us telling them what they should and shouldn't do. We've got to allow God's Spirit to begin to work. And I gave three or four examples. Some, who went there and then transitioned back. I gave an example of one woman who transitioned and, is a committed Christian and transitioned and has stayed there. So whether we agree with that or not is not the point. We still need to love, and accept that person. So I think our language and our posture are critical. And recognising we're on this lifetime journey. That would be my initial thoughts off the top of my head. Yep. Yeah. Do you want to be a runner for me, Clive?
Like, I know it says in the Bible there's male and female,
Yep.
and we're born with both the X and the Y, and the Y is the dominant, whether we're male or female. So are you saying it's okay to be transgender or homosexual or whatever, but it's the act of being so is wrong?
I think we need to take homosexuality out of the equation. I'm not talking about that. I think that the internal struggle that people have, gender dysphoria, is not a sin. All right, we need to be very clear on that. People don't choose that. It is not a sin that you have. In fact, it's not a sin to be same-sex attracted either. That is not a sin. So we need to just be very clear there. So that what people do with, how people work out that struggle, I would personally I think people need, in an ideal world, people need to learn to come to terms with the biological sex that they're born with. You can read the notes, but I'm taking a traditional position as it were, but with a huge amount of grace thrown in there in terms of the reality of people's struggle in this area. Is that clear?
We've actually got somebody in our family who's, in our wider family, who's
Yep.
transitioning. And I would have to say that when it's a family member,
Yep.
all these issues go completely out the window. It's a non-issue. It's then simply trying to be really, really supportive, because the suicide stats are horrendous. Yeah, they're just off the roof. And so your biggest thing is just to be really, really supportive and just wrap everything around them and wrap everything around the family, because it's a horrible thing for the family to go through.
So I'd make a couple of comments there. One is, I think, and the British story is really interesting around them, but there is now starting to get some significant pushback around, physically transitioning kids, and I think that's hugely dangerous, and there's starting to be some real pushback around that, when you get a 6-year-old and even a 13-year-old. So there's some major pushback now around from the medical non-Christian community around that practice, particularly in Britain. The second thing is that actually and it's in the second article from the Evangelical Alliance. It's got some stats there that suggest that even those who transition, there's a large amount, a significant number detransitioning or going back the other way, which can be problematic, but also that actually the mental health stats for those who have transitioned are also actually really bad. So transitioning doesn't necessarily, it seems to for some, but for many actually it does not help in terms of the suicidal and mental health issues. So so there's some challenges there.
I think too the reason that they push, well, certainly in this case where they were pushing the transitioning, was simply because of the really high suicide risk. So I think there's a real fear that if nothing happens with these kids, that they'll commit suicide. That would be
There's some interesting stuff around, you can read it on the net around. There's certainly some pushback around transitioning early, and actually, society might actually, there's one article that says actually society is starting to actually really question a lot of the trans ideology. But at a personal level, it doesn't impact, obviously, it's mental health sort of aspect, but yeah. I don't claim, we've got some doctors here, I'm not claiming to be a medical expert on this, I just,
My question is, I go back, how can you witness to these people? Because you know that God created a man and a woman, and then suddenly my family, I like the woman, I like the man. How far and where are you going to stop to sharing the gospel to them? That when Jesus comes, that, you got to follow what God say, a man and a woman. And you don't want to criticize them. In the same time, you got to go what God's words is. And that's why I'm sort of be aware. And because we don't know when Jesus comes, how many people are going to live like that, So
we should witness to everybody. And some of the examples I gave were examples of people that had transitioned, who came to faith. So, we need to share the gospel. The gospel was for everybody. Doesn't matter where they are in terms of trans or sexuality or whatever. The gospel is for absolutely everyone. The outworkings of that in terms of working through discipleship. I mean, if someone has transitioned and then comes to faith, they might not physically be able to untransitioned anyway. So, that's another whole question of discipleship, of working a journey. But the gospel is for absolutely everyone. What I've expressed is a conservative position, so that's why I deliberately have given you the full notes of what I've said, so you don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm arguing biblically for a traditional position. I gave the counter arguments that people use in the Bible for a different position. I don't believe they stack up. So please do not hear me wrong in that. However, that doesn't alter how we relate to people as people. And we share the gospel and we share the love of Christ with everybody. And how people then work on their discipleship journey in terms of outworking what it means if I'm identified as trans and I come to faith, what does that mean? There might be a whole lot of other stuff that God does first before he starts. This is not a simple issue here. So let God and the Holy Spirit do what he does. So yeah. Anyone else before? Because you've already asked one question. Oh, sorry. Yep. Where are we? Oh, yes. Sorry. Hey?
My step counter.
Yeah, your step counter over here.
Hi, Keith.
Hi.
I've recently finished reading a book called We Cannot Be Silent. I don't know whether that's come across your reading list or not. I think something that maybe you didn't touch on, which might be good for people to hear, is the question of what God's plan originally is.
Right.
And his plan was for there to be, well, in my opinion, but I'm asking you,
Yep.
His plan is ultimately there'll be male and female,
Yep.
and people will have a marriage with those two genders and grow
Yep.
up in that family environment.
Yep.
And that the reason, why has this happened?
Yep.
Would you agree that's all just because of sin being introduced in the world right back in the Garden of Eden? Is that the reason why
We have
we
people
have
now
this? Yes,
really
this
confused
issue.
around this issue?
Yeah.
Yes, but I just want to really qualify that the yes is at a theoretical level, because the danger is if you said that to someone that's grappling with this issue, then they feel like, well, therefore I'm broken, like there's something wrong with me, or that I'm a sinner. Now, the reality is we're all broken and we're all sinners and we're all affected by sin. So when you get cancer, that's ultimately, theoretically, because of the fall. But you don't say that to the person because, that's not very helpful because, well, actually, it's because of the fall. Well, that's theoretically true, but actually it's of no relevance to, you know what I mean? So yes, at a theoretical level, but we just need to be very careful around the language we use, around how we express that. And as I say, some of the ideologies that I mentioned have very much influenced into this field. So the social ideologies that I mentioned are very much influencing this. But why someone at 3 years old has this deep desire to be of the opposite gender, I don't know. I'm not sure that too many people know either why that is the case. I don't have an easy answer for that. Yeah. So I think we'll close it there if it's all right. I'll answer questions privately. Sorry?
Can you please just explain what you mean by the term dysphoria, because it's not something I'm familiar with.
Yep, so gender dysphoria is simply the tension between that I feel, this is not me, but I feel female but I'm born a male. So it's a tension, a dysphoria, a tension between your biological sex versus your gender, that the two don't align. So that's what we mean by gender dysphoria. So yeah, so the two, your internal sense and your external body don't align. And look, I think for 90% of us, this has just never been an issue. Like, we never even thought about it. It's just not, it's very hard to imagine that there's a tension because we don't consciously think about that. It's not something we ever think. The two just align. However, for some people, for whatever reason, which I can't fully explain, for some, they don't align. And that is that are those that make up the trans community, when those two don't align. So, all right, enough questions. I don't know about my step count, but my sweat count's going up. So, 11:23. I think we will. I think I want to close with communion. We might miss the final song. We went long last week on baptism, but I'd like to close with communion. Look, as I mentioned, this is a difficult, complex subject. I don't claim to have all the answers on it. Please feel free to pick up the reading material and to read and to ponder. But I just want us to come back to the cross and communion. The reason I want to come back to the cross is, first of all, the cross should actually engender within us an attitude of humility. Now, Christians are not known for their humility, unfortunately, and yet the very centre of our Christian faith is an act of incredible humility. Jesus Christ humbled himself to die on a cross for us. And so, as we have communion this morning, it brings us back to a reminder of that humility. The cross also reminds us of the fact that we all need God's grace. Every single one of us needs the grace of God. We're all broken and sinful human beings that desperately need God's grace. And the cross also reminds us that ultimately it's love that transforms us. And some of those stories I told, people were changed by love, not anger, but love. Love is transforming, and it's actually, we're here today because of the love of Christ. Love ultimately is transforming. The other thing the cross reminds us of, and for all of us this is a struggle, is that our primary identity is found in Jesus Christ. Not in our status in society, whether we've got lots of money or not enough money or whatever. It's not our status, our primary identity is not, am I single or married? It's not, our primary status is not in our sexuality or our political views. Our primary status, above all else, our primary identity has to be found in Jesus Christ. And I think for all of us, we're trying to work that out because we all revert back and we find our identity in our job and identity in lots of other things. And the cross reminds us And for those who are struggling with gender dysphoria or the trans community, ultimately, they too need to know that their primary identity is found in Jesus Christ. And that supersedes every other identity that we like or want to assume. So the cross reminds us of that. Our primary identity is that we're loved by God and we're children of God. When that, the Bible says, when Paul says, when the love of God gets so deep within us, then actually that transforms us. Because actually the other things that we often cling to for our identity actually start to disappear and go. So I'm going to invite the communion team to come and serve communion. I invite you to come forward and in your own time take communion. Take it in your own time, just reflect on those things, and then I'm going to get us to stand and we're going to close in prayer. So, and there's some music playing too. Beautiful song, which we'll start singing here called What He's Done.